We just got our first look at next-gen console sales. One of the numbers we've all been waiting for is how many consoles has, well, everybody sold. And while we don't quite know those numbers because the information we're going to talk about here comes from actually some data scraping of eBay, the NPD group, and a couple other sources, we only can actually get sales figures from two specific sources. Are they coming from Sony and are they coming from Microsoft? And while these companies aren't really eager to just run out there and scream how many they've sold, we kind of have to look at the tea leaves and other information from third-party sources to understand how things are selling and just the overall market in general. And the NPD group, specifically in this case, Matt Piscatelli, put out some information relating to what happened in November that helps to understand the picture here. And the spoiler alert is that Nintendo keeps crushing it. Sony sold more consoles and Xbox is sold out. That's kind of like the high level look, but there's some more detailed information that I think is definitely worth diving into. And most of this data I'm going to talk about here initially comes from the NPD group, where they said that for November, of content, accessories, and hardware, there was $7 billion of revenue that transacted. That is just a massive figure, which is 35% higher than a year ago. Now, that's not all that surprising when you consider how many new consoles were sold in November. If it was anywhere close to what happened last November, that would be pretty tragic, honestly, for the gaming industry, but no concerns there. And then it says year-to-date spending has totaled $44.5 billion, 22% higher than what was seen in 2019. Now, that's all, again, based on the fact that new consoles were launched, people bought new consoles, and every single console they could buy has been sold. And this is here in the US, by the way, so you can get an understanding of how massive this market is and why Sony and Nintendo and Microsoft continue to aggressively pursue new business models in this arena. It says consumers spent a record $1.4 billion on new video game hardware. So there you go. That is the actual figure of how much of that $7 billion was directly related to new hardware. And it says PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series year-to-date hardware spending reached $4 billion, or 34% higher than a year ago. That is basically comparing this year's console sales to last year's, and it just continues to grow. PlayStation 5 was November's best-selling hardware platform in consumer spending. No surprise there. I've been saying it for a long time that I fully expect the PlayStation to outsell the Xbox Series X and S, at least for a while. But there's other things to consider too. Keep in mind the fact that Phil Spencer said, hey, we didn't start producing consoles until late in the generation cycle, not until late summer, and Sony was producing them, I believe, much earlier. And so there was more volume of the PlayStation. But the more interesting thing to keep in mind, that if you look at the PlayStation 5 achieved the highest launch month in unit and dollar sales for video game hardware platform in U.S. history. So what they're saying there is, hey, the PlayStation 5 sold the most amount of hardware in that month in history of U.S. sales. Now, you might be wondering, what was second place? Well, actually, second place was held by PlayStation 4 back in November 2013. Sony has an extremely loyal fan base, and they just continue to keep upgrading their consoles, as you would expect. And that's why Sony is expected to continue to sell more consoles than Microsoft this generation. But this generation, keep in mind, is not always based on the fact that how many consoles are sold, considering that Microsoft is opening up to things like xCloud, where they have game streaming on many different platforms, and Microsoft admittedly is only really I shouldn't say only worried about, but Microsoft's defining metric for this generation is actually Game Pass subscriptions, not so much console sales. Doesn't mean they're not focused on console sales. It just means that is Microsoft's focus, is that they believe the longer future is in Game Pass subscriptions, not necessarily direct console sales. But the Nintendo Switch actually led the market in units sold. The Switch has just been another phenomenal home run for Nintendo, and this, I think, is like the 24 consecutive months that Nintendo Switch has been the volume leader. Now, you might be a little confused here, saying you just said PlayStation 5 was PlayStation 5 did the most revenue. The Switch did the most units, meaning that there was more dollars transacted over to Sony, but Nintendo actually moved more pieces of hardware. Not all that surprising. The Switch and its derivatives are really well and aggressively priced and should be a big hit this holiday season. And so moving over to some more interesting data. So one of the things that has been cropping up, and we all knew this was coming, that scalpers were just swiping the consoles before you could do it. They're doing it with bots or whatever mechanism they were doing it, and a lot of them were being sold on eBay and Craigslist. Well, we can't actually scrape Craigslist. An individual named Michael Driscoll was able to scrape the data that was sold on eBay during the month of November. And there's actually some pretty interesting information here. So according to his research, 33,000 PS5s were sold on eBay through December 1st. Now, the PS5 with a disc had a median price of about $1,020 or $1,020. The discless retailed or was selling, I shouldn't say retail, was averaging about $937, which if you break all this down means that scalpers as a whole were able to net about $19 million just through the PlayStation 5, just from that launch window. On the Xbox side, about 30,000 were sold on eBay through December 1st, with an average price for the Series X of $865 and the Series S of $469, and netted those scalpers about $10 million in profits. And you can begin to understand why scalping is such a profitable business. Now, obviously, not a single individual made $19 million in profit, but on the PlayStation side, especially with a median price of $1,000 and $1,021, for some reason I keep struggling over saying that, it's pretty clear why they were going after this market so heavily. Now, I fully expect that those prices start to drop off quite a bit, and pretty quickly too, because while it is still hard to get a console, every time a new shipment comes in, that's more, you're saturating the market, and so those prices should continue to fall, and hopefully in the springtime they will normalize around something a little bit more reasonable, such as the MSRP. But there you go. Those are some of the bigger numbers. We've also had some interesting things happening just in the gaming market in general today, with EA saying that they're going to outbid Take-Two, I should say, for Codemasters, which is some popular titles like F1, I believe, and for $1.2 billion. There's been some big gaming acquisitions. Obviously, Microsoft bought Bethesda, or is trying to buy Bethesda, for about $7.5 billion. Now, EA is going aggressively to get Codemasters away from Take-Two, and we're all sitting here kind of wondering if Take-Two is going to respond and try to up their bid, if you will. But there's been some big dollar transactions happening in the industry, and you can begin, if you just look at these numbers, $7 billion in the month of November, you begin to understand why that the next generation, not even the next generation, kind of like the current and future, entertainment models are going to involve a lot of gaming titles. We're seeing just heavy investments from the big three players here. EA, while they don't have a specific console, they're definitely, they have a nice portfolio of titles, and they're going to just keep adding to them, which reminds me that EA Play is now coming to Game Pass on December 15th, I believe. And so there's another mechanism how EA is going to continue to add value to their older titles and bring in more cash flow. There's just a ton of money moving around the gaming industry right now, and the console sales are definitely a big component of that. So what I do really find interesting is just how close the Xbox and PS5 sales figures were on eBay. I mean, there's 3,000 console sales different based on this, which is about 10% or so. I would honestly have guessed that the PS5 number would have been quite a bit higher, personally speaking, just because the PlayStation 4 outsold the Xbox One about 2-1, so that market would be pretty significantly larger to sell people to, which is why the average selling price on eBay was a little over $1,000 for the disc version. And so I personally would have expected that model to be a little bit more stretched, but here we are. And maybe that's just the number, capacity limited and how many people could actually get consoles during that time. And we won't actually know these numbers. Our best bet for learning actual console sales will be the earnings reports from these companies. Microsoft both companies should be reporting in January. I'm more likely to believe that we will hear PlayStation definitive numbers in January. We will not hear Xbox. I bet we will hear Game Pass subscriber numbers, but I'd be surprised if we actually heard consoles sold, just because we know that PlayStation is outselling the Xbox console. We have it here from the MPD group saying, hey, there was just more units in market, but at the end of the day, all the consoles from PlayStation and Xbox both completely sold out. So regardless if you're on green or blue or whatever red color you are, consoles are just flying off the shelves. It's a good thing for the gaming industry as a whole, because that means we're going to see more investments, more top quality titles, and that is a good thing, and that just reminds everybody that it's a good time to be a gamer.